Christian prayer can be very formal. One can read out prayers in the course of a formal liturgy in a service. But it can also be spontaneous, that is, extemporaneous, where publicly or privately one is just talking to God. With a few exceptions, Christians generally don't use pre-composed written out prayers as mantras, as words with magical powers. They generally view it as interpersonal communication between the prayer and God. A famous prayer in Christianity is called the Lord's Prayer. It's what Jesus teaches his disciples when they ask him how they should pray. It's given as a sample prayer. This end part, by the way, is not found in the critical Greek text used by modern translations. That's why you see that in the older King James translation and not in others. The prayer is notable in that it's simple, it views God as approachable, and as someone who cares about daily needs, and who is willing to forgive and protect. Since the earliest times in Christianity, Christians have had a practice of meeting once a week on the Lord's Day, which is Sunday, the first day of the week. A little bit confusingly, they refer to that as the Sabbath, as the day of rest. But of course, the traditional Jewish Sabbath is on Saturday. Christians switched to Sunday because they believed that it was on a Sunday that Jesus was raised from the dead. The earliest Christians, when they were still within Judaism, met in Jewish synagogues and worshipped God in the temple in Jerusalem. After then Christianity became mostly Gentile, mostly non-Jewish, they met in private homes, sometimes in private homes that were a little bit expanded to hold more people. And sometimes they met in remote places, outside of town, or even in caves, places where they could avoid the wrath of their pagan neighbors. After about the time of Constantine, we find the practice of church building. These are buildings dedicated to Christian worship, and in some cases initially modeled on certain types of pagan religious buildings, pagan temples. That's been the common practice in almost all kinds of Christianity up till now, although still there are people around the world who worship in homes. Over the course of the Middle Ages, churches evolved from rather heavy, squat structures into the soaring, beautiful Gothic cathedrals, full of colored windows, filled with natural light. Anyone, when they walk into a medieval cathedral, feels they've entered a different world. It makes one feel small and in awe of the building. Some would say it's like entering heaven temporarily. A recent development within Protestantism are what's called megachurches. These are basically just churches with a huge number of people that meet together each Sunday. Could be 1,000, could be 10,000, could be 50,000. Sometimes they have large buildings that somewhat resemble smaller sports arenas. Sometimes they have multiple campuses. That is, they consider themselves one church and maybe even have one head pastor, but they meet in several different locations in a city all at once. Many people love megachurches. Others lament it as a kind of Walmartization of Christianity. With a few exceptions, such as the Amish and the Mennonites, Christianity has had a pretty simple dress code. For most people, most of the time, the only requirement has been modesty, that one not show off one's physique and one's sexuality. And up till recent times, probably most groups of Christians had women cover their heads, that is, cover their hair, but not their faces, when they come to the weekly meeting. This is because of something that Paul says. In most of Christian history, Christians have not practiced full veiling where one covers the face, though that has happened at certain times and places. Sacraments are ceremonies through which God's grace is sought and conferred. They're specific ceremonies that have to be carried out by legitimate clergy, generally by priests. And in Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox theology, these are the main conduit of God's grace in the world. In about the 11th century, theologians decided that the exact number of sacraments was 7. The first is infant baptism. Catholics sprinkle some water on the baby, and Eastern Orthodox dunk him in a pot. And there's confirmation. Orthodox do this to babies, Catholics do it to young people. Penance, that is confession, in a formal context to a priest. Eucharist, that's the taking of communion, the taking of the bread and wine that have been blessed and are in some sense the body and blood of Christ. There's the sacrament of marriage and the sacrament of ordination, or holy orders, where you officially become a priest or a monk or a nun. And finally, there's holy unction. This is a blessing given by Roman Catholics on one's deathbed. It's kind of a final outgoing blessing, and Orthodox do it whenever it's felt to be necessary. Protestant theology is different. Protestants don't view divine grace as flowing only or mostly through these official church ceremonies. following Martin Luther, most Protestants stick with baptism and the Eucharist. These are the two practices specifically commanded and modeled in the New Testament. Some Protestants baptize babies, and others, since the Anabaptist movements in the 16th century, baptize only those old enough to profess faith. They do some of these other things too. Obviously, Protestants have a religious ceremony for marriage, but they don't consider it one of the sacraments or on the same level as baptism and the Eucharist. In our next segment, saints.